In this lesson, I want to explore the concept of using a for each loop over a range of cells. So in this brand new workbook, I have 12 values in column A. It's just the months of the year. And let's say what I want to do is to write the uppercase version of the month, so January in all capital letters, for example, in column B. And I want to do that for every single value in column A. So I could do a standard for loop that we introduced a few lessons ago. I could define an iterator variable of I, set it equal to 1, go all the way to 12. That would work, and that's a totally suitable solution, but there's an even more elegant solution that we can do with the for each. Let me show you how it works right now. In my VBE, I'm going to define a new procedure called capitalize months. And I know that I want to reference the range of cell A1 to A12, so I can actually just write it out here so it's easily available. And what do I really want to do over this range? What I want to do in this range is iterate over every single cell within it. Well, if you think about it, every single cell within a range is actually another range object itself. A1 is a range, A2 is a range, A3 is a range, and so on. So whenever I use for each with a range, VBA is smart enough to figure out that I actually want to go over every single cell within it. It's especially very simple when it's something like a column because it's just going to proceed from the top all the way to the bottom. But even if I have a multi-cell range, for example, let me go ahead and highlight this range right here on the worksheet. Even if I have a range like this, we can iterate over this cell by cell, and the Visual Basic logic will simply iterate cell by cell in a row direction. So C3, then D3, then E3, then F3, then it'll move on to the next row of C4, D4, E4, and so on. And we can use this idea to essentially iterate over every single cell and not even worry about how many cells we have to iterate over. So right here, I know that I'm going to need a for each. And I know that I'm going to be iterating over every single cell. That's a good name to pick. Again, this is just a variable name that is up to the developer, but what I'm iterating over fundamentally is a cell within the range. So I can do something like this, and then I want to make sure I do two things. The first thing is write the value next cell at the end to make sure I move on to the next one. And finally, of course, now that I know that I'm representing a range, I want to make sure I declare that cell variable before I use it. That's just best practice. So now I know the cell variable that I'm using in the for each loop is a range object. So again, this is a little bit of an interesting phenomenon because we're iterating over a range, but every single thing within that range that we're iterating over is also another range object. We have a collection here in a way that is a collection of objects that are also the same object. It's kind of interesting. So what do we want to do here? Well, what we want to do is each cell here represents a valid range object. We can use the offset property. Remember, offset is used to select something relative to where we are right now. And what we want to do is, let's say we start in cell A1, we want to move one cell to the right. So that's going to be 0 rows down, one cell to the right. That's what we can use the offset property for. Let's assign it a value. And what do we actually want to assign the value? We want to take the current value in the cell, for example, A1's value is January, and we want to uppercase it. You may recall that we have this uCase built-in function, which allows us to uppercase a value. We know that cell represents our entire cell of A1, and we can just extract the current value from it. So this is going to be January the very first time around, then February, then March, and so on. We're going to take that value, we're going to uppercase it. The right side is going to evaluate before anything else happens. Once we have the uppercase version, we're going to take our current cell, we're going to move one column to the right, 0 rows down, and we're going to write that uppercase value in the cell to the right. So this should be good to go. I'm going to press F5 to execute. Let me just actually click out of this thing. Let's go ahead and do F5, and it's worked exactly as expected. Completely, perfectly worked as expected. Let me show you another way that we can go ahead and complete this exact same process. I'm just going to remove all of my code here in column B. We can actually make this a little bit more dynamic by replacing range here with the keyword selection. Remember that selection is a dynamic property that refers to whatever is currently selected or highlighted on my spreadsheet. So for example, this is a selection, this thing that we see in gray, and then I've selected this thing right here. And if I've clicked into a single cell, then that's my selection. What I can actually do is highlight a selection like this one, and what VBA is going to do is iterate over every single cell or range in that dynamically selected selection. So if I highlight everything from cell A1 to A12, click into here and execute this procedure, the exact same result is going to happen. I'm going to have the capitalized versions of the months populate in column B to the right. I want to conclude this lesson by showing you how this iteration will work if we have something more complex than simply a single column, as I mentioned earlier. So I'm just going to define another procedure here. I'm just going to call it sample iteration. Doesn't really matter. And I'm going to basically copy the code that I have up here because I want to do the exact same thing. And for each cell in the selection, let's make sure we put a next cell at the end. What I simply want to do is output with debug print. Each cell or each range has a property available on it called address, which is just going to return the actual A1 notation for that cell's address in the worksheet. And I can use this to demonstrate how it's going to iterate over each one of the cells in my selection. So for example, if I have the selection of 2x4 or 4x2, and now I'm going to click into here, press F5, we're going to see the order in which it's iterating is D4, E4, F4, G4. So it's going to move horizontally among the cells in a row, and once it's done with that horizontal traversal, it moves on to the next row and begins that process anew. Predictably, if we have only a single column, let me execute this and remove all the code down here. In that case, it's simply going to iterate downwards along that column. So here is D6, D7, D8, and so on, moving down. And predictably, if we have a single row like so, what it's going to do is just iterate from left to right across that row. So in this case, we're going to have D2, E2, F2, and G2. This is actually left over from the end. So here's the code from the procedure that we just executed. It's going to move left to right and then from top to bottom if we have a range that is more than kind of a single column or a single row. That's all there is to cover here. We talked about how we can use the for each loop to iterate over a range of cells. Remember that every single object within a range is technically another range, which allows us to have full access to a range's properties and methods and perform really cool operations like this.